It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. The Chicago skyline loomed in the distance, gray clouds swirling like ghosts above the courthouse. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed against the silence, casting a sterile glow over the nearly empty courtroom. Judge Evelyn Carter adjusted her robe, pushing away the exhaustion gnawing at her. The day had been long, one case after another, each one a different shade of tragedy. But as she flipped through the next file, something made her pause. Elijah Walker, age 8. Her eyes scanned the report, and her stomach twisted. 7 foster homes, multiple transfers, a history of uncontrollable behavior. She looked up. The boy sat stiffly in his chair, small shoulders hunched, dark eyes staring at the floor. He wasn't crying, not fidgeting, just silent. The social worker beside him whispered something, but Elijah didn't react. His hands clutched a crumpled photograph, knuckles white. Evelyn cleared her throat. "Mr. and Mrs. Turner, I understand that you've requested a transfer for Elijah." Richard and Vanessa Turner sat upright, their polished appearances betraying an undercurrent of frustration. Vanessa spoke first, her voice clipped. "We've tried, Your Honor. But he refuses to listen. He doesn't speak. He barely eats. He's difficult. We believe he would be better suited in a more structured environment." Evelyn folded her hands. Another rejection. Another child passed around like an unwanted burden. "Elijah," she said gently, "do you understand why you're here today?" For the first time Elijah moved. He lifted his head, dark curls falling into his eyes. Slowly, deliberately, he stood up. The room stilled. Even the air seemed to tighten. Elijah turned, facing the judge fully. He stared at her, his gaze unwavering, filled with something unreadable, something deeper than words. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "You're my mom." The courtroom gasped. Evelyn felt her breath leave her lungs. A sharp, inexplicable jolt shot through her chest. "What?" The word barely escaped her lips. Elijah said nothing more. He just held up the photograph in his trembling hands. Evelyn's heart slammed against her ribs, because in that worn-out, faded picture was her, 8 years younger, pregnant. Her mind spun. That wasn't possible. Her baby had died the day he was born. Hadn't he? The silence was suffocating. Evelyn Carter sat frozen on the bench, unable to look away from the trembling hands holding that worn-out photograph. The image was unmistakable. Her 8 years ago, with a swollen belly, captured in a moment she had buried deep in her past. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. The courtroom, filled with seasoned social workers, attorneys, and the foster parents who had just rejected Elijah, remained eerily still. No one moved. No one spoke, It was as if the very air had been sucked from the room. Then, suddenly, "That's ridiculous." Vanessa Turner's sharp voice shattered the silence. She pushed back her chair, her face flushed. "That boy is lying." Richard Turner nodded quickly beside her. "Your Honor, this child has a history of manipulative behavior. He's been through multiple homes. He's clearly confused." Evelyn heard them speaking, but their words barely registered. Her mind was somewhere else, back in time, back to a hospital bed, back to the day she had lost her child. She forced herself to speak. "Elijah." Her voice wavered, something it never did in court. "Where did you get this photograph?" Elijah didn't answer. He simply stared at her. The boy's dark, expressive eyes held something beyond sadness, recognition. It sent a chill down her spine. He believes it. He knows it. Sarah Martinez, the assigned social worker, cleared her throat. "Your Honor, I can confirm that Elijah Walker has been in the foster system since infancy. His biological parents were listed as unknown on his file. Evelyn forced herself to breathe. Then, how? She swallowed hard. How does he have a picture of me? Sarah looked equally shaken. I don't know, Vanessa scoffed. Because he stole it, obviously. He's acting out. He does this all the time, making up stories, refusing to listen to authority. I told you, he's impossible to deal with. Elijah's small fingers clenched around the edges of the photograph. His entire body was trembling. Evelyn saw the way he flinched at Vanessa's words. Something inside her snapped. That's enough, Mrs. Turner, Evelyn said sharply. Her judge's voice, the one that demanded obedience in a courtroom, rang out, silencing Vanessa immediately. She turned back to Elijah, softening her tone. Elijah, listen to me. Do you know who I am? Elijah nodded, his curls bouncing slightly. You're my mom, he whispered. His voice was fragile, uncertain, but hopeful. Evelyn's pulse thundered in her ears. She shouldn't be entertaining this. It wasn't logical, it wasn't possible. Yet why did her entire body feel like it already knew the truth? Her hands were cold as she steadied herself. Do you know where you were before you entered the system? Elijah hesitated, then shook his head. No. His voice was so small. I don't remember. Evelyn inhaled sharply. Her throat felt tight. How could she ask an 8-year-old to explain something even she couldn't understand? We're wasting time here, Richard muttered, rubbing his temples. Your Honor, we'd like to finalize our request for immediate transfer. Elijah is clearly unstable. He is not unstable, Evelyn cut in. Richard blinked in surprise. Excuse me? She straightened her posture. I'm granting a recess, she announced. I need time to review this matter privately with Elijah. The gavel hit the wood. Case adjourned. For now. Minutes later, Evelyn led Elijah into her chambers, her hands still slightly shaking. The boy sat across from her at the large oak desk, his legs dangling from the chair. He had barely spoken since the courtroom. Evelyn studied him carefully. He was small for his age, his frame too thin. His oversized sweater looked like it had been through 100 washes. But his eyes, they were strikingly familiar. She swallowed. Elijah, do you know why I need to talk to you? He hesitated before nodding. You called me your mom. Her voice was quieter now, almost afraid of the words. Why? Elijah gripped the photograph in his lap. I just know. That's not an answer. He looked down. I've always known. Ever since I can remember, I've had this picture. His small fingers traced the edges. I keep it with me because it feels like home. Evelyn felt something crack inside her. This wasn't a game. This wasn't manipulation. This boy, this child, believed with every fiber of his being that she was his mother. A soft knock at the door made her jump. Sarah Martinez stepped inside cautiously, holding a thin folder. Your Honor, I thought you'd want to see this. Evelyn took the file with slightly numb fingers. Inside was Elijah's original birth record, except it wasn't under the name Elijah Walker. Her breath hitched. The name listed was one she had never seen before, but the birth date matched exactly. Her hands gripped the document tighter. This can't be right. Sarah swallowed. I checked 3 times. Evelyn's gaze shot back to Elijah, her pulse now hammering so loudly it was deafening. What was happening? What had happened 8 years ago? Elijah watched her with wide eyes, as if sensing the storm inside her. Then slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled something else out. A second, even older photograph. This one sent a jolt of pure ice through her veins. It was a hospital picture. A newborn. wrapped in blue. Her newborn, her son, the child she had been told was dead. But he hadn't died. He had been taken. Evelyn Carter had spent her entire career piecing together stories, testimonies, evidence, timelines. Every case was a puzzle, and she had prided herself on her ability to solve them. But this was different, because the puzzle wasn't about someone else. It was about her. And the missing piece was sitting right in front of her. A boy with her eyes, her blood, her child. The hospital photograph in her trembling hands was old, slightly faded at the edges, but she recognized it instantly. The tiny newborns, swaddled in a blue hospital blanket, had been hers. Her son. Evelyn's lungs refused to take in air. The memories of that night, the worst night of her life, rushed back like a flood. It had been storming. The rain lashed against the hospital windows as she lay exhausted in the sterile delivery room, her body aching, her vision blurry from tears. A nurse had been there, holding her hand. She remembered crying, gasping for breath, asking to see her baby. The doctor's voice had been cold, detached. "I'm so sorry, Miss Carter. There were complications. Your baby didn't make it." Evelyn had screamed, begged, pleaded. "Let me see him. Please, let me hold him." But they hadn't let her. The doctor had only shaken his head and muttered something about stillbirth protocols. Then, just like that, it was over. They had sedated her, and when she woke up, her son was gone. No body, no burial, just paperwork and a hollow ache in her chest. Evelyn blinked, her grip tightening around the photograph. "Elijah," she whispered, "who gave this to you?" The boy fidgeted, his small fingers curling into his sleeves. I don't know. I've always had it." Sarah Martinez, the social worker, cleared her throat uneasily. "Your Honor, I don't know what's going on here, but I do know one thing: this isn't normal." She hesitated, then placed another document on the desk. Evelyn's eyes scanned the paper. Her stomach dropped. It was Elijah's birth certificate, except it wasn't. The name listed wasn't Elijah Walker. It was something else, something fabricated. Yet the birth date was identical. The hospital was identical. This wasn't just a cue, someone had erased his identity. And that meant someone had stolen him. Evelyn's head swam. She needed answers. Now. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Sarah, I want every record you can find from Riverside Memorial Hospital. Every birth from the night of March 11th, 8 years ago. Every adoption request. Every stillbirth certificate." Sarah has evil. She turned to Elijah, forcing herself to stay calm. "I need you to be honest with me. Do you remember?" And Elijah shook his head. Just the home before this one." His voice dropped. "They weren't nice." Evelyn swallowed hard. How much had this child suffered? She reached across the desk, placing her hand gently over his. "We're going to figure this out," she promised. "I won't let you go through this alone." Elijah's fingers twitched, but he didn't pull away. For the first time since entering her courtroom, he looked safe. The city lights flickered through the rain as Evelyn unlocked the door to her townhouse, leading Elijah inside. His small frame looked even tinier in the vastness of her living room. He hesitated, his shoulders tensed, as if expecting to be scolded for stepping too far. Evelyn's heart ached. "You don't have to be afraid here," she said softly. "Come in." Elijah nodded hesitantly, his wide eyes scanning the room. He clutched his backpack tightly, as if afraid it might be taken away. Evelyn noticed the way his fingers curled around the strap protectively. A survival habit. How many nights had he spent packing and unpacking, never knowing where he'd end up next? She exhaled slowly. "Are you hungry?" Elijah hesitated, then nodded. She led him to the kitchen, pulling out leftovers and warming up a plate of pasta. As she set it down in front of him, he just stared, her brow furrowed. "What's wrong?" Elijah's voice was barely a whisper. "No one's ever made me food before." Evelyn's throat tightened. Oh, God. She forced a smile, swallowing down the lump in her throat. "Well, I hope you like it." Elijah picked up the fork cautiously, took a small bite, then another. Within moments, he was eating like he hadn't had a full meal in days. Evelyn sat across from him, watching in silence. This child, her child, had been starving, in more ways than one. That night, Evelyn lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. This wasn't just a legal case anymore. This was personal. Her son had been alive this whole time, taken from her. Someone had lied to her. Someone had forged records. Someone had stolen her baby. She grabbed her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. It rang twice before a deep voice answered. Marcus Chen. Evelyn exhaled sharply. "I need your help." A pause. Then, "Damn, Carter. Haven't heard that tone from you in a long time." She didn't have time for pleasantries. "I need you to look into something. 8 years ago, Riverside Memorial Hospital. The night of March 11th. Marcus sighed. "Youth realize that hospitals got a reputation, right? A lot of sealed records. A lot of missing information." "I know." "Why now?" Evelyn glanced toward the hallway, toward the small boy sleeping soundly, for what was probably the first time in his life. Her heart clenched. "Because I think they stole my son." Silence. Then, Marcus exhaled sharply. "Jesus." Evelyn's grip tightened around the phone. "Can you help me?" Another pause. Then, finally, "I'm on it." Evelyn closed her eyes, exhaling shakily. She had spent years advocating for children who had been abandoned, lost, and taken advantage of. But now, the lost child was hers, and she would burn down the entire system before she let him slip away again. The storm outside had grown stronger. Wind howled through the city streets, rattling windows and sweeping rain against the pavement. It was as if the universe itself had sensed the storm brewing within Evelyn Carter's heart. She stood by the window, staring into the darkness, gripping her phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had just spoken to Marcus Chen, and now there was no turning back. She was going to uncover the truth. Somewhere in this city. In the files of a corrupt system, in the records of a hospital that had stolen children. The answers were waiting, and she was ready to burn down every last wall standing between her and her son. The next morning, Evelyn walked into her office, her heels clicking against the marble floor with purpose. She had spent years in this very courtroom, rendering verdicts, upholding justice, and dismantling corruption. Now, for the first time in her life, she was fighting not as a judge, but as a mother. Sarah Martinez, the social worker, was already waiting at her desk. She looked nervous, shifting a thick stack of case files in her arms. "Your Honor," Sarah began hesitantly. "I don't know how to say this, but I pulled the hospital records you asked for, and something isn't right." Evelyn's stomach tightened. She gestured for Sarah to continue. Sarah swallowed hard and placed the files on the desk. Elijah's original birth certificate, or at least what should have been his birth certificate, doesn't exist. Instead, there's only an adoption record, an illegal one. Evelyn's pulse quickened. "Illegal?" Sarah nodded. "His paperwork is full of inconsistencies. The original name listed was erased and rewritten. But the most disturbing part, his birth parents are marked as deceased." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Deceased. Whoever had done this hadn't just stolen Elijah. They had erased him. Sarah continued, flipping through another file. And it's not just Elijah. There's a pattern. Several infants from Riverside Memorial Hospital, born over the span of 3 years, were declared deceased, but were later adopted through a private organization called New Horizons Family Services. Evelyn's blood ran cold. She had seen that name before. New Horizons. It had come up in corruption cases, quiet whispers of a shadowy adoption agency that reallocated children to wealthy families using legal loopholes and falsified records. But no one had ever been able to prove anything. Until now. Evelyn exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of her desk. Where did these children end up? Sarah hesitated. Some in foster care. Some with families that legally adopted them. But many, they just vanished. That night, Marcus Chen called. You're not going to believe this, he said, his voice grim. The guy who signed off on your baby's death? Dr. Thomas Wells. Evelyn's grip on the phone tightened. I know that name. Yeah, well, you should. He was the chief of obstetrics at Riverside Memorial for 10 years, until suddenly 5 years ago, he resigned, vanished off the radar. Evelyn's mind raced. Why would a well-respected doctor suddenly disappear? Marcus sighed. Because someone didn't want him talking. There was a long pause. Then Marcus said the words that sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. Dr. Wells is missing. The next day, Evelyn and Marcus sat in a dimly lit diner in downtown Chicago. Marcus had been working all night, going through old medical records, digging into financial transactions, and pulling every possible lead. He slid a folder across the table. There's one person who might be able to tell us what happened, he said. A nurse, Jennifer Kirkland. Evelyn opened the folder, scanning the documents. Jennifer Kirkland had worked at Riverside Memorial for 15 years. Her employment ended the same year Dr. Wells resigned. She was fired, Marcus said. No reason listed, no employment records after that. It's like she disappeared off the grid. Evelyn clenched her jaw. We need to find her. Marcus smirked. Already ahead of you. He pulled out his phone, showing Evelyn a grainy photo of an old newspaper clipping. Jennifer Kirkland was listed as a nurse volunteer at a free clinic on the South Side. Evelyn exhaled. Let's go. The free clinic was tucked between 2 rundown buildings, a forgotten relic of a healthcare system that had long abandoned the city's poorest. Inside, Jennifer Kirkland sat behind a cluttered desk, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a tired ponytail. She barely looked up when Evelyn and Marcus approached. If you're looking for free flu shots, we ran out last week. Evelyn placed the folder on the desk. We're not here for flu shots. Jennifer finally glanced up, her tired eyes scanning Evelyn's face, and then her face went pale. She recognized Evelyn. She knew. Evelyn leaned in. You worked at Riverside Memorial 8 years ago. Jennifer's hands trembled. I don't know what you're talking about. Evelyn pulled out Elijah's photograph. Yes, you do. Jennifer inhaled sharply, her gaze locking onto the photo. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, her voice broke. They stole your baby. Evelyn felt her entire world tilt on its axis. Jennifer's voice was barely a whisper. They did it to so many. Marcus leaned forward. Who's they? Jennifer swallowed. New Horizons. The hospital. The entire system. Evelyn's throat tightened. I need proof. Jennifer hesitated. Then she reached into a locked drawer, pulling out an old, worn notebook. I kept records, she said. I knew what they were doing was wrong, but I was too afraid to say anything, too afraid they'd come after me. Evelyn's hands shook as she flipped through the pages, dates, patient names, stolen infants. Her son's name, his real name, was listed. Ethan Carter. Evelyn stared at the notebook. She had spent years building a life where she could fight for justice, where she could uphold the law. But the law had failed her. It had failed Elijah. And now, she was going to tear it down. She stood, gripping the notebook tightly. "No more hiding," she said. "We expose them." Jennifer's breath hitched. "If you do this, they'll come after you." Evelyn's gaze darkened. "Let them try." The city of Chicago pulsed outside Judge Evelyn Carter's home. Streetlights flickered over the rain-soaked pavement as she pulled into her driveway, gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. Elijah sat in the passenger seat, his small hands curled around the frayed edges of his hoodie. His silence filled the car like an unspoken storm. For the past hour, neither of them had spoken. After leaving Jennifer Kirkland and her shocking revelations, Evelyn's mind had been racing. "They stole your baby." Those words rang in her ears over and over again. She turned off the engine and exhaled slowly. "We're home," she said softly. Elijah didn't move. She tried again. "It's safe here, Elijah. You don't have to be scared." This time, he glanced at her. His eyes, deep, dark, and haunted, searched her face as if he wanted to believe her. But he had lived too many years, knowing that nowhere was truly safe. Evelyn led Elijah inside. The house was too clean, too perfect, a stark contrast to the chaos their lives had just become. Elijah hesitated at the doorway. His shoulders were tense, his small body ready to run at any moment. "You can look around if you want," Evelyn said, keeping her tone light. "Your room is upstairs. She stopped herself. She didn't know what to say. This wasn't just any child. This was her son. Elijah said nothing. He stepped inside cautiously, his sneakers barely making a sound, against the polished wood floor. Then, slowly, he sat down in a corner. Not on the couch, not at the table. In a corner. Evelyn's heart cracked. She crouched beside him. "Elijah, you don't have to sit on the floor." He looked up at her. His voice was barely above a whisper. Do you want me to?" Evelyn swallowed the lump in her throat. How many times had this child been told he wasn't wanted? She shook her head. "No, sweetheart. I want you to be comfortable." Elijah studied her for a moment before nodding. He pulled his knees to his chest and stared at the wall. It was going to take time. That night, Evelyn woke to a sound she hadn't heard in years. A quiet, trembling hum. She followed the sound down the hallway, stopping at Elijah's room. The door was slightly ajar. Through the crack, she saw him curled up under the blanket, humming a melody. It was a lullaby. The same lullaby she had sung to her unborn child all those years ago. Evelyn's breath hitched. Tears stung her eyes as she stepped back, pressing a hand to her chest. It was him. It had always been him. The next morning, Evelyn met with Jennifer Kirkland again. They sat in a tiny cafe, away from prying eyes. Jennifer's hands trembled as she stirred her coffee. "You have no idea how dangerous this is," she whispered. "New Horizons is bigger than you think. People have died for getting too close." Evelyn narrowed her eyes. "I don't care. This is my son." Jennifer exhaled shakily. "Then you need to be ready for what's coming." She reached into her purse and pulled out a stack of documents. "These are the real records," she said. "I stole them before I left the hospital. They prove everything, how babies were taken, how their names were changed, how the adoptions were arranged illegally." Evelyn flipped through the pages, her hands tightened around the paper. Elijah's birth name was listed, Ethan Carter, her baby who had been stolen, erased, and placed in a system that never cared for him. Evelyn clenched her jaw. I'm taking them down. Jennifer looked at her sadly. Then, you'd better be prepared for them to fight back. That night, Evelyn and Elijah sat in the living room. She watched as he hesitantly flipped through a book she had given him. A book about dinosaurs. You like dinosaurs? She asked. Elijah nodded slowly. They're strong. Evelyn smiled. You're strong too. Elijah hesitated. Then, in a barely audible voice, he whispered, Not strong enough. Evelyn's heart ached. She wanted to tell him that he was safe now, that she wouldn't let anything happen to him. But then, a sudden noise outside. A car door slammed. Evelyn's body tensed. She moved quickly, peering through the blinds. A black sedan was parked outside, unmarked, tinted windows. Someone was watching her house. Her heart pounded. Then, her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She hesitated before answering. A deep voice spoke, Drop this, Judge Carter. Evelyn's blood ran cold. The line went dead. The next morning, Marcus called. His voice was urgent. Evelyn, Riverside Memorial Hospital is on fire. She nearly dropped her coffee. Oh, what? They're burning everything. The records, the evidence. Someone is covering their tracks. Evelyn's stomach twisted. New Horizons wasn't just some shady adoption agency. They were powerful, and they were erasing their crimes. A sick feeling settled in her chest. She had Jennifer's copies of the records. But what if they knew? What if... A crash from the kitchen interrupted her thoughts. She ran inside, heart pounding. Elijah was crouched on the floor, his hands covering his head. A shattered plate lay beside him. His breathing was ragged. Evelyn rushed to his side. Hey, it's okay, she said gently. It's just a plate. But Elijah's entire body shook. And then she understood. He thought someone was coming for him. Her heart broke all over again. She pulled him into her arms. It's just us, Elijah. I promise. No one is going to take you away again. Elijah hesitated, then slowly. He clung to her. It was the first time he let her hold him. And Evelyn knew then, without a doubt, that she would fight for him until her last breath. The city never truly slept. Chicago's skyline gleamed against the midnight sky, but beneath the surface, darkness festered. In one of the city's forgotten corners, a hidden truth was waiting to be unearthed, one that had remained buried for nearly a decade. And Judge Evelyn Carter was about to rip it wide open. Evelyn barely slept. The fire at Riverside Memorial Hospital wasn't an accident. It was a message, a warning. But instead of scaring her away, it only fueled her resolve. At sunrise, she walked into the kitchen, where Elijah was already awake, seated at the counter with a bowl of cereal in front of him. He wasn't eating, just stirring the spoon absently, lost in thought. Morning, she greeted, forcing her voice to stay light. Elijah gave a small nod. His eyes were still shadowed with fear from the night before. She sat across from him. Bad dreams? For a moment he didn't answer. Then his voice, barely above a whisper, broke the silence. They were going to sell me again. Evelyn froze, her hands clenched into fists under the table. Who? She asked, her voice dangerously calm. Elijah swallowed hard, then shook his head. I don't know their names, but when I was little, I heard them talk. They said I wasn't placed right, that someone would pay more for me. A sick feeling churned in her stomach. Elijah was never supposed to end up in foster care. He was supposed to be sold. Her jaw tightened. No one is ever going to take you again. I swear it. Elijah didn't respond, but for the first time, his eyes held something close to belief. Later that morning, Evelyn met Marcus Chen in a secluded diner on the south side. Marcus had been digging into New Horizons Family Services for weeks. Now, he looked more paranoid than ever, constantly glancing over his shoulder, his fingers drumming anxiously against the table. "They know we're on to them," he muttered the moment Evelyn sat down. She raised an eyebrow. "You think the fire was just a coincidence?" Marcus snorted. "They burned down a whole hospital to erase evidence. What do you think?" Evelyn exhaled sharply. "Do we still have enough to prove anything?" Marcus slid a thick folder across the table. "More than enough," he said. "Bank transactions, fake adoption records, and—" He hesitated. "A list." She flipped it open. Her blood ran cold. Dozens of names, children. Most of them marked as deceased in official records. None of them actually dead. Evelyn's grip tightened. "This is a trafficking operation." Marcus nodded grimly. "And the judge who approved most of these adoptions? He's still sitting on the bench. Judge Franklin Mendez. A man she had worked with, trusted." Bile rose in her throat. "I need proof." Marcus leaned in. "Then you need to talk to the one person who knows everything." Evelyn frowned. "Who?" Marcus hesitated. Then, "Dr. Thomas Wells." Finding Dr. Wells wasn't easy. The disgraced former head of obstetrics at Riverside had vanished 5 years ago. Some said he fled the country. Others whispered he was silenced. But Marcus had a lead. A private clinic, off the books. That night, Evelyn parked outside a small, dimly lit medical office in the outskirts of Chicago. Her heart pounded as she stepped inside. A nervous receptionist eyed her suspiciously. "Do you have an appointment?" Evelyn didn't bother answering. She flashed her badge. "I'm here to see Dr. Wells." The woman tensed. He doesn't work here." Evelyn crossed her arms. "Then why is his car outside?" Silence. Then a door creaked open. At the back of the office, a man stepped out. Dr. Wells. His once pristine white coat was wrinkled, his face gaunt with exhaustion. But his eyes, sharp, calculating, studied Evelyn with recognition. "I was wondering when you'd find me," he murmured. Evelyn didn't waste time. "You helped steal my child." Dr. Wells sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "I did a lot of terrible things. But I didn't steal your son." She clenched her fists. "Then who did?" He hesitated. Then he pulled out a single envelope and slid it across the desk. Evelyn picked it up, opening it with shaking hands. Inside was a birth certificate. Elijah Walker, born August 14th. Mother, Evelyn Carter. Father, unknown. A lump formed in her throat. Dr. Wells leaned forward. "There's something else." He took a deep breath. Elijah wasn't the only one. Evelyn stared at him. "What do you mean?" she demanded. Dr. Wells exhaled sharply. "Elijah was part of a batch. A program." The room seemed to tilt. "A program?" He nodded. "There were at least 50 infants, stolen from birth, sold to the highest bidder." The words hit like a gunshot. Evelyn's stomach churned. "Who was behind it?" Dr. Wells hesitated, then shook his head. "If I tell you, they'll kill me." Evelyn narrowed her eyes. "They'll kill you anyway." Silence. Then his face hardened. Judge Franklin Mendez. The air in the room turned to ice. Evelyn drove home in a daze. Her hands trembled on the wheel. Judge Mendez, a man who had ruled alongside her, who had shaken her hand at fundraisers, a child trafficker. The weight of it all crushed her. By the time she pulled into the driveway, exhaustion consumed her. She stepped inside, exhaling sharply. "Elijah, I'm home." No answer. Her heart skipped a beat. "Elijah?" She called again, her voice rising. Still nothing. A chill ran down her spine. Then she saw it. The front door, slightly open. Her breath caught. She had locked it before leaving. And then a single note on the floor, scrawled in red ink. Drop this case, or you'll lose him again. Evelyn's vision blurred. Then, a sound upstairs. A faint, muffled cry. Elijah. The moment Evelyn saw the note, her entire body went cold. Drop this case, or you'll lose him again. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Then, the sound upstairs. A muffled cry. Elijah. She bolted, 2 steps at a time, heart hammering against her ribs. Elijah, she gasped, bursting into his room. The closet door was ajar. Small, shaky breaths came from inside. She yanked it open and found Elijah curled into a ball, clutching his knees to his chest. Tears streaked down his face. His tiny body trembled violently. Evelyn dropped to her knees. Baby, what happened? Elijah flinched at her touch. His lips parted, but no words came. She softened her voice. Elijah's sweetheart, tell me. Then she saw it. The red mark around his wrist, like someone had grabbed him, hard. Someone had been inside the house. Elijah barely spoke the rest of the night. Evelyn didn't sleep. She sat in the living room, lights off, a kitchen knife clutched in her shaking hands. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind, sent her nerves into overdrive. They had gotten inside. How? She checked the security system. Nothing. The cameras? Disabled. Someone had done this professionally. By morning, Evelyn called Marcus Chen. He answered on the first ring. What happened? They were inside my house, she whispered, while I was gone. A long silence. Then his voice, low and urgent. You need to leave, now. Evelyn grabbed only the essentials. Elijah's backpack, a change of clothes, her legal case files. Within minutes, she had him in the car, gripping the wheel so hard, her knuckles turned white. Elijah sat quietly in the passenger seat, knees drawn up, staring out the window. She reached for his hand. We're going somewhere safe. He didn't look at her. Nowhere is safe. Her throat tightened. I won't let them take you again. For the first time in hours, Elijah turned to face her. His voice was barely a whisper. They said you'd leave me. Evelyn's breath hitched. What? They said you'd get scared and give me back. His fingers clutched the seatbelt strap, his knuckles going white. That you'd realize I wasn't worth the trouble. Her vision blurred with rage. She cupped his face gently. Elijah, look at me. He hesitated, then lifted his big, frightened eyes to hers. You are worth everything? Her voice shook with emotion. Do you hear me? Everything. No one is ever taking you from me again. A single tear slid down his cheek. For the first time he nodded. But deep down, Evelyn knew. This was just the beginning. Marcus met them at an abandoned motel outside Chicago. This place isn't on any records, he explained, as he led them into a small, dimly lit room. You'll be safe for now. Evelyn barely nodded, her mind racing. Marcus, they were in my house. I know, he said grimly, and they'll come again. A deep rage burned inside her. No. She shook her head. I'm done running. I want names. Marcus exhaled. Then you won't like what I found. He pulled out a thick envelope. Inside were photographs. Judge Franklin Mendez, Dr. Wells, a man in a black suit. Evelyn frowned. Who's this? Marcus's face was grim. No, that's the man who runs the whole operation. He slid another photo forward. A newspaper article. Billionaire Edward Langdon funds charity for orphaned children. Elijah gasped softly. Evelyn's blood turned to ice. Langdon, a household name in Chicago. A man who moved in political and financial circles so high, he was practically untouchable. And now, he had set his sights on Elijah. That night, Marcus stayed to guard the room. Evelyn tucked Elijah into bed, brushing his curls from his forehead. "I love you," she whispered. Elijah's eyelids drooped. "I love you too." She pressed a kiss to his forehead, then quietly closed the door. Then she stepped into the adjacent room, where Marcus sat by the window, gun in hand. Evelyn's jaw tightened. "What's next?" Marcus glanced at her. "We go after Mendez first. He's the weak link. If we can break him—" A loud crash. The window shattered. Marcus lunged forward. "Get down!" Gunfire erupted. Evelyn's heart slammed into her ribs. "Elijah!" she screamed, scrambling toward his rooms. Marcus grabbed her. "No! Get out the back!" A bullet ripped through the wall. The room exploded into chaos. Marcus shoved Evelyn toward the bathroom. "So go now!" But she didn't listen. She threw open Elijah's door. Empty. Her heart stopped. "Elijah?" she gasped. Silence. Then, a single open window. Elijah was gone. Evelyn's mind screamed as she stood frozen at the open window. The cool night air rushed in, carrying the distant sound of tires screeching. They had him. Her son was gone. No, 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 she gasped, hands shaking, as she grabbed the window ledge, peering into the darkness. Footsteps pounded behind her. Marcus burst in, gun raised. "Where's Elijah?" Evelyn whirled around, her breath hitched. They took him." Marcus cursed under his breath, sprinting toward the parking lot. Evelyn followed, her vision blurred with panic. Her son was out there somewhere, in the hands of monsters. Marcus yanked open his laptop, fingers flying over the keyboard. "I put a tracker in his shoe," he muttered. "But if they're smart, they'll find it fast." Evelyn's heart pounded as she clutched the table. "Where?" A red dot flickered on the screen. Northwest Highway, moving fast. They were taking him out of the city. Evelyn grabbed the keys to Marcus's car. "Let's go." Marcus blocked her path. "Evelyn, no. We don't know who we're up against." She glared at him, her voice like steel. "They have my son." Marcus sighed. "I know. That's why we do this smart." He picked up his phone and dialed. "Bennett, it's me. We got a kidnapped kid." "Yes, the same case. I need an APB on a black SUV, heading northwest. Now." He hung up and grabbed his gun. "Let's move." 1:47 a.m. The highway was mostly deserted. Marcus drove fast, weaving between lanes, the GPS tracking the red dot ahead. Evelyn clenched the dashboard, her nails digging into the leather. Then, the SUV. Up ahead, speeding toward an exit. Marcus hit the gas. "Hold on." The tires screeched as he swerved onto the ramp, tailing the vehicle. Inside, Evelyn could barely breathe. Suddenly, the SUV veered off-road. Marcus cursed. "They're heading to the woods." Evelyn's stomach dropped. They were going to make him disappear. Marcus slammed the brakes near the tree line. Evelyn jumped out, before the car even stopped. "Elijah!" she shouted into the darkness. A muffled cry. Her blood ran cold. Marcus raised his gun, scanning the area. Then, a shadow moved. A tall man in a black coat, dragging Elijah toward a waiting car. Evelyn saw pure terror in her son's wide, tear-filled eyes. Something inside her snapped. She ran. "Stop!" The man spun around, and Marcus fired. A gunshot rang out. The man staggered back, clutching his shoulder. Evelyn lunged, grabbing Elijah, wrapping him in her arms. He sobbed against her chest. "Mom." Tears burned in her eyes. "I got you, baby. I got you." Marcus rushed up. "We have to go, now." More headlights in the distance. Backup was coming. Evelyn didn't wait. She carried Elijah to the car, heart racing. They sped away, leaving the kidnappers behind. 2:30 a.m. They arrived at a safe house outside the city. Marcus locked the doors. "We're safe for now," Evelyn sat on the couch, Elijah in her arms. His small body shook. His fingers clutched her shirt like a lifeline. Evelyn stroked his back. "You're safe, sweetheart. I won't let them take you again." A long silence. Then, I thought you wouldn't come." Her heart broke. She cupped his face, looking into his scared eyes. "I will always come for you. Always." A tear slipped down Elijah's cheek. For the first time, he truly believed her. 2 days later, Evelyn sat in the clinic, heart pounding. Marcus handed her an envelope. "You ready?" She took a deep breath. No, but she opened it anyway. Her eyes scanned the paper. 99.99% match. Elijah was her son. Tears blurred her vision. She turned to him, hands shaking. He was watching her, eyes wide. "Did I pass?" he whispered. She broke. Evelyn pulled him into the tightest hug of her life. "Oh, baby, you were always mine." Elijah's small arms wrapped around her, and for the first time he smiled. The storm was coming. Evelyn stood outside the courthouse, gripping the DNA test results. This was it. Her fight for Elijah was about to begin. She inhaled sharply, steeling herself. They wouldn't take him away again, no matter what it took. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, social workers, lawyers, and in the middle of it all, Elijah. He sat quietly beside Evelyn, small hands gripping the hem of his sweater. Judge Arnold Fitzpatrick adjusted his glasses. "Let's begin." Evelyn stood. "Your Honor, I am filing for immediate custody of Elijah Walker." A murmur rippled through the room. Then, another voice cut through the noise. "Objection." All heads turned. A tall, silver-haired man rose from the opposing table. Daniel Richardson, the man who had adopted Elijah illegally. And he wasn't going to give up without a fight. Richardson's lawyer, Victoria Hale, stepped forward. "Your Honor, my client legally adopted Elijah Walker 5 years ago. He's the only father this boy has ever known." Lies. Evelyn clenched her fists. "Your Honor, my son was stolen at birth." Victoria smirked. "With all due respect, Judge Carter, you have no proof." Evelyn threw the DNA results onto the table. "This is my proof." The room fell silent. Judge Fitzpatrick skimmed the document, his brow furrowing. "This states that Elijah is your biological child," he said slowly. Richardson's jaw tightened. Victoria forced a polite smile. "Your Honor, with all due respect, a biological connection does not mean parental fitness." Evelyn's blood boiled. "This is not about fitness. This is about justice." She turned to Elijah, her voice softening. "Elijah, do you want to stay with me?" The room held its breath. Elijah hesitated, then his small voice cut through the tension. "Yes, she's my mom." Evelyn's heart nearly stopped. Victoria scoffed. "Your Honor, this child is 8. He does not have the legal capacity to make such a decision." Evelyn's eyes flashed. "Then let's hear from the people who do." The courtroom doors swung open. Marcus strode in, holding a thick file. "Evidence?" Marcus placed the file on the judge's desk. Bank transactions, emails, hospital records, proof of an illegal adoption ring. Richardson was at the center of it. Judge Fitzpatrick skimmed the documents. His face darkened. "Ms. Hale," he said slowly, "does your client wish to explain why he made multiple wire transfers to an adoption agency currently under federal investigation?" Richardson paled. Victoria stiffened. "Your Honor, Bam! The doors burst open again. FBI agents flooded in. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Daniel Richardson stood frozen. The lead FBI agent strode forward. "Daniel Richardson, you are under arrest for child trafficking and conspiracy to commit fraud." Gasps filled the room. Evelyn exhaled sharply. They had won. Richardson turned to Elijah, desperate. Elijah's son. Tell them. Tell them you want to stay with me. Elijah looked up. Tears filled his big brown eyes. Then softly, he shook his head. Evelyn's heart swelled. Two officers grabbed Richardson, cuffing him. As they dragged him away, he screamed, "You'll regret this, Carter." But Evelyn wasn't afraid. Her son was finally safe. 1 week later, Evelyn and Elijah sat in the same courtroom. But this time, it was different. Judge Fitzpatrick adjusted his glasses. "Miss Carter, do you swear to love and protect this child for the rest of your life?" Evelyn squeezed Elijah's hand. "With all my heart," the judge smiled. "Then, I grant full legal custody of Elijah Walker to Judge Evelyn Carter." The courtroom erupted in applause. Evelyn pulled Elijah into her arms. "You're officially mine, baby." Elijah beamed. "I always was." The nightmare wasn't over. Evelyn Carter had just won the hardest legal battle of her life. She had proven Elijah was her son. She had fought the system and won. But now, Elijah was gone. It happened in an instant. One moment, Elijah had been at her side. The next, he had disappeared. Panic gripped Evelyn's chest. She spun around, scanning the courthouse steps. "Elijah?" No answer. Her heart pounded. She ran down the sidewalk, pushing through the crowd. "Elijah." Still nothing. Then, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Her hands shook as she answered. A voice. Low. Cold. "You should have walked away, Carter." Evelyn's blood ran cold. They had taken him. Evelyn didn't waste a second. She called Marcus. "I need you, now." Within minutes, Marcus was by her side. "What happened?" Evelyn's jaw clenched. "They took him." Marcus cursed under his breath. "Who?" Evelyn's grip tightened on her phone. "The people we exposed. New Horizons, the adoption ring. They were retaliating, and they had taken her son. No ransom note, no demands, just silence." Marcus pulled out his laptop. "Okay, let's think." They retraced every step. Security cameras, witnesses, nothing. Then Marcus froze. "Wait." He zoomed in on a blurry figure, a black SUV, tinted windows, and inside, Elijah. Evelyn's stomach dropped. Oh, they had to move. Fast. Marcus made the call. FBI. Every contact he had. They ran the plates. Stolen. No registered owner. Whoever took Elijah knew what they were doing. Evelyn clenched her fists. But so did she. Then, a break. Marcus's phone buzzed. A message. From an unknown number. "Turn back, or the boy disappears forever." Evelyn's eyes darkened. They were threatening her. But they had just made a mistake. Marcus analyzed the message, the metadata, the signal. A location pinged back. An abandoned warehouse. Just outside the city. Evelyn's heart pounded. Elijah was there, and she was going to get him back. They arrived at night. Marcus had his gun. Evelyn had her rage. They crept forward, weapons drawn. A single light flickered inside. Then, a sound. A small, broken voice. "Mom?" Evelyn's breath hitched. "Elijah." She ran forward. And a gunshot rang out. A single gunshot. And then, silence. Evelyn froze at the sound of the gunfire. Her heart stopped. "Elijah!" she screamed. Marcus shoved her down, shielding her behind an overturned crate. More shots rang out. The warehouse was a war zone. Flashes of gunfire lit the darkness. They weren't alone. Marcus returned fire, his jaw clenched. "Stay down," he barked. Evelyn wasn't listening. She had to get to Elijah. She peered through the shadows and saw him. Elijah bound to a chair, eyes wide with fear. And standing over him, Dr. Wells. Evelyn's blood boiled. "Let him go, Wells," she shouted. Dr. Wells smirked. He held a gun to Elijah's head. "You should have stayed quiet, Judge Carter," he sneered. Evelyn stepped forward. hands shaking. "You don't have to do this." But Wells laughed. "You think this ends with me. You have no idea how deep this goes." Then movement. Elijah's fingers twitched. He was trying to free himself. Evelyn met his eyes. He was scared, but he was fighting. "Hold on, baby." Then, a distraction. Marcus fired a warning shot. Dr. Wells flinched, and in that moment, Elijah kicked the chair backward. The gun went off, missing him by inches. Evelyn sprinted forward, tackling Wells. They crashed to the ground. She fought like a mother protecting her child. Punches, scratches, clawing at his throat. She wouldn't lose Elijah again. A second gunshot. Dr. Wells collapsed. Marcus lowered his gun. He had saved them. Evelyn scrambled to Elijah, tears streaming down her face. She untied him, pulling him into her arms. He was shaking. "Mom, I knew you'd come." She held him tight. "Always." Then, sirens. FBI agents stormed the warehouse. Dr. Wells was taken away in handcuffs. The nightmare was over. But Evelyn wasn't done. This wasn't just about Elijah. She was going to bring them all down. Outside the warehouse, Elijah held on to Evelyn. He wouldn't let go. Marcus watched them, shaking his head. "You're not just a judge anymore, Carter." Evelyn nodded. She was a mother, and she was going to make sure no other child suffered like Elijah did. This was only the beginning. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. Evelyn sat in the courtroom, her hands clenched into fists. Today was the day she would fight for Elijah. The prosecution had ironclad evidence against New Horizons and Dr. Wells. But Evelyn knew justice wasn't guaranteed. There were powerful people who wanted this buried. She wasn't going to let that happen. "I want to testify." Evelyn's heart dropped. "Baby, you don't have to do this." But Elijah shook his head. "They need to hear me." He had spent 8 years in silence. Not anymore. The courtroom was packed. The media, the press. The world was watching. Judge Thompson called the session to order. The prosecution went first. FBI agents, former victims, even a whistleblower from New Horizons. The evidence was overwhelming. Money trails, fake adoption records, testimonies, everything pointed to a massive conspiracy. Then, it was the defense's turn. And they were ruthless. They painted Evelyn as unstable, a mother blinded by emotion. They claimed Elijah was lying, that he was a troubled foster kid who couldn't be trusted. Evelyn's blood boiled. She wouldn't let them break Elijah. Then, silence. Elijah stepped forward, a small boy, alone on the witness stand. But he wasn't afraid. He looked straight at the judge and spoke the truth. "They took me away from my mom." The courtroom held its breath. Elijah told his story, the abuse, the lies, the pain. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Then, Marcus stood up, holding a DNA test. "Your Honor, this is proof. Evelyn Carter is Elijah's biological mother." Gasps filled the courtroom. The truth was undeniable. The defense was crumbling. Judge Thompson looked at the jury. A long pause. Then, "Guilty." The room erupted. Dr. Wells and the New Horizons executives were sentenced. Evelyn clutched Elijah to her chest. It was over. He was finally safe. Justice was served. But the battle wasn't over. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Dr. Wells was led away in handcuffs. The verdict was in, guilty on all counts. Evelyn clutched Elijah's small hand, her heart still pounding in her chest. She won. She got her son back. But as she looked into Elijah's tired eyes, she knew this was only the beginning. The FBI's investigation wasn't finished. New Horizons Family Services was just the tip of the iceberg. More than 300 children had been stolen and placed in the system. Some had been adopted by unsuspecting families. Others were never found. The media exploded. This was the biggest child trafficking scandal in decades. Evelyn knew she couldn't just walk away. But before she could fight another battle, she had to help Elijah heal. After years of bouncing between foster homes, of living in fear, of being told he didn't belong, Elijah struggled to adjust. He refused to sleep alone. He flinched at loud noises. And worst of all, he didn't believe he was safe. One night, Evelyn found him hiding under his bed, clutching that same worn-out photograph. Her heart shattered. "Elijah, baby, you don't have to be afraid anymore." His voice was barely a whisper. "What if they come back?" Tears burned in Evelyn's eyes. She wrapped him in her arms and whispered, "No one is ever taking you away again. Not while I'm breathing." Elijah wasn't the only one who needed help. Hundreds of families were now searching for their lost children. Evelyn watched as desperate parents flooded the courthouse, begging for answers. Some had been looking for years. Some thought their children had died. And now, they had hope again. Evelyn knew she had to do something. She couldn't just be a judge anymore. She had to be an advocate. But not everyone wanted her to keep digging. Threats started pouring in. Anonymous calls. "Drop it, Carter, or your son disappears again." Evelyn refused to be intimidated. She had spent 8 years without Elijah. She wouldn't live in fear now. She went public. She exposed every name, every corrupt official, every judge who had sold a child. And it shook the nation. Evelyn took the fight to Congress. Laws had to change. Children needed protection. She testified before the Senate. She demanded reform in the foster system. And as she spoke, Elijah watched from the front row. His mother, fighting for kids like him. For the first time, he felt safe. That night, Evelyn tucked Elijah into bed. For the first time, he wasn't afraid. For the first time, he knew he had a home. He looked up at her, eyes full of trust. "You never stopped looking for me, did you?" Evelyn felt tears in her eyes. She kissed his forehead and whispered, "I never will." The battle was won, but the war had just begun. Evelyn Carter was no longer just a judge. She was a mother, an advocate, a fighter. And she wasn't done yet. Evelyn made a decision that shocked the entire legal community. She resigned from the bench. The woman who had spent her life upholding the law would now fight to change it. Evelyn didn't need a gavel. She needed a voice, and she was going to use it. The system failed Elijah. It failed hundreds of children, and she refused to let it happen again. She founded the Carter Foundation, a place for children like Elijah, for those who were stolen, for those who were lost, for those who never had a voice. And Elijah was right beside her, no longer a victim, but a survivor, a leader, a symbol of hope. Elijah wanted to help. He knew what it was like to be forgotten. So he spoke out. He shared his story. And the world listened. "I spent years waiting for someone to come for me. No child should have to wait." Donations poured in. Support flooded in from across the country. The Carter Foundation became a beacon of hope. But some people didn't want her to succeed. The New Horizons case wasn't over. FBI investigations uncovered something terrifying. The organization had connections overseas, a global trafficking network. This was bigger than anyone imagined. Evelyn received another threat. This time, it wasn't just words. A break-in at her home. Elijah's bedroom ransacked. A chilling note left on his bed. "You can't save them all." Evelyn wasn't afraid. She looked at Elijah. "We'll see about that." The Carter Foundation wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a movement. Parents reunited with their stolen children. More trafficking rings exposed. And Evelyn stood at the front lines, fighting for justice, fighting for Elijah, fighting for every lost child. And she wouldn't stop. The fight wasn't over. Evelyn Carter had taken on the system, and she had won. But justice wasn't just about one case. It was about changing the world. And now, Evelyn and Elijah were about to do exactly that. The nation was watching. Evelyn Carter, Elijah Walker, the mother and son who took down a trafficking empire. Now, they stood before Congress, fighting for change, a new law, a new future. Evelyn took a deep breath. She looked across the room. Politicians, reporters, cameras, all eyes on her. But she wasn't nervous. She was ready. The law failed my son. The law failed hundreds of children. And it will keep failing them unless we do something. Her voice was steady, powerful, unshakable. She laid out the evidence, the corruption, the cover-ups. She named names, exposed the truth. And then she stepped aside. It was Elijah's turn. The boy who once never spoke now had the world listening. He looked up, brave, strong, determined. And then he spoke. I was 8 years old. I had no home, no family. They were going to sell me. The room fell silent. How many more? His voice shook, but his message was clear. How many more children have to suffer? Tears filled the eyes of people in the room. And then the applause came, loud, thunderous, overwhelming. The bill passed, a new law to protect children. And it had all started with Elijah. The trials began. The guilty were sentenced, corrupt judges, doctors, officials, gone. New horizons, dismantled. But Evelyn knew the fight wasn't over. Because trafficking didn't stop with one organization. It was bigger than that. And she wasn't done yet. What started as a shelter became a movement. The Carter Foundation expanded nationwide. More shelters, more investigations, more lives saved. And Elijah was there every step of the way, speaking, leading, inspiring. He had turned his pain into purpose, and now he was changing the world. Evelyn and Elijah stood together, mother and son, survivors, fighters, advocates. Elijah looked up at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. You were always my mom. Evelyn's heart swelled, because she knew. He was right. What would you have done if you were in Evelyn's shoes? Can you imagine the heartbreak, the fight, the moment Elijah called her mom for the first time? Tell us in the comments, what was the most powerful moment for you? And if this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Another story of resilience, another battle for justice, another journey that will leave you speechless. Stay tuned, stay inspired, and remember, sometimes the most unexpected bonds are the ones that change everything.